Now, for Anthony Albanese's wake-up call on anti-Semitism and the Middle East, Mike Kelly is the former Labor Minister for Defence Material, and he was a colonel in the Australian Army, serving in Bosnia, East Timor and Iraq. He left Parliament in 2020, but is now the convener or co-convener of Labor Friends of Israel. In short, he speaks with authority on Labor politics and foreign affairs. And today he issued a stern warning for the Prime Minister to reset his moral compass on Israel. Kelly says Labor has rewarded the terrorists in the Middle East and jeopardised our national security. Mike Kelly, thanks for joining us. Are you frustrated, disappointed, angry about the Albanese Labor government's approach to Israel?
Well, I think all of us who are involved with Labor Friends of Israel have been very disappointed and frustrated. It's been like watching the death of 1,000 cuts as we watch, our diplomatic credibility, our leverage just dissolve in front of our eyes. And frankly, this latest support for the UN resolution, it really just indicates too that the message hasn't gotten across that the government is putting at risk our national security here and our social cohesion, because it appears as if they're rewarding every new escalated act of violence out there by those activists who are committed to that course of action. And so every time that they're rewarded for those courses of action, they're just emboldened to take it further and achieve the next step in their ambitions. And we've just seen that recently with the instance in Sydney of those terrible vandalism and violence. And at the same time, coinciding with that, the denial of a visa to Ayelet Shaked. So, we'd really call and urge the government to consider the impact this is having in our national security concerns domestically.
That's a hell of a charge coming from you, a former Labor frontbencher, a Labor man, saying that this Labor government has effectively rewarded terrorism and in doing so is encouraging more extremism.
Absolutely. And really the approach that we need to be taking right now is confronting the disintegration of the United Nations as a relevant institution. Because basically what we're seeing, and there have been detailed studies on the fact that democracy is on the back foot right now internationally. And 71% of the world's population live under autocracies. There's only 13% of it left living in what we would call democracies. And that's being reflected in the erosion of UN institutions. And unless we stand against that, we will be saying goodbye to the usefulness, the relevance, the importance of the United Nations in any of these international security or peace issues that we face. And, that's being underpinned too by the really virulent information warfare that's being waged, in particular by what I call the rectangle of ratbags in Russia, Iran, China and North Korea, whose principal goal in this information warfare is the corrosion of liberal democracies. And, what I would say is, well, why don't you take the approach of saying, well, we're not going to take any further steps in this. We're not going to enter into any further discussions on statehood unless the hostages are released, unless Iran and its galaxy of proxies end their war of aggression, which is the key war crime that's been committed here, and renounce violence, unless we say, hey, how about you get your Palestinian state when you meet a whole list of very important criteria that a liberal democracy would want to see in place.
That's such an important point, Mike. Sorry, I thought you were finished there. Sorry to cut you off. Such an important point that the freeing of the hostages, the release of the hostages should be the first precondition to any other steps in this. That's the morally clear and the strategically obvious point, but so many in the world seem to ignore that. You talk about these bad actors operating through the United Nations. Of course, in the latest votes, Australia has thrown its lot in with them and dozens of other countries in the United Nations, where, as you say, the non-democratic countries get the equal vote to a democratic nation like Australia. In doing this, in these latest votes in the UN, has the Albanese Labor government abandoned Israel?
Well, this is shocking when you think of all of the history of Israel and Australia's relationship of shoulder-to-shoulder confrontation against fascism, tyranny, terrorism, and the fact that Australian lives have been saved by the sharing of intelligence by Israel. There was an incident in just recent years where we would have lost an airliner if it hadn't been for the assistance of Israeli intelligence. They have been with us shoulder to shoulder in the First and Second World War, our diggers serving alongside them. And this is the way we're rewarding them at the moment when they face this existential threat by this war of annihilation that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran and their elements in Syria and Iraq have been waging. And that is their ultimate goal. And what are we saying at this time? Oh, we're not going to help them defend themselves against that threat. We're not going to recognise the daily inundation of rockets, ballistic missiles, drones on a massive scale, and the hostage taking of 250 citizens, the brutalisation of them, the horrendous, sadistic activities they conducted in their invasion on the 7th of October. What are we doing here in taking sides with Iran, Russia, China and North Korea? That's not in our national interests, and it's not the right thing to do.
Now, the former opposition frontbencher, now backbencher, Julian Leeser, singled out two cabinet ministers last night on my program. He singled out Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister, presumably because he's a leading figure of the Labor right, and also Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General, because he's a Jewish Australian. He said that if they don't agree with these moves, they should be resigning from cabinet. Here's Julian Leeser.
At what point does Mark Dreyfus and Richard Marles say enough? We cannot stand by and let this happen. We need to resign on a point of principle. Because if they don't, they will show themselves to be the cowardly lions of Australian politics.
Mike Kelly, is Julian Leeser right?
Yeah, Julian stands on very high moral ground. After all, he did stand down as a Shadow Attorney General in relation to the Voice debate that we were having last year. So, he's demonstrated he's a man of principle. And look, I think all of those Labor colleagues of mine need to examine their consciences on this. And, we're losing voices in the caucus at the moment. Bill Shorten's stepping down now, and he was a great voice of reason and common sense in that mix. And so I'm wondering where, that voice is going to come from here. And what really concerns me too is that these people who are sitting around the table in the cabinet at the moment, I think they've lost touch with the broader Australian community, and it will pay them back in spades electorally if they continue to stay out of touch. And I look at the electoral result in Queensland and what's been going on around the world, and there's a great sort of iceberg of citizen concern that doesn't get out in the streets and commit vandalism or attack people. The Hindus, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Thais, the Filipinos, the Pacific Islanders, Persians, traditional Australians, all deeply concerned about the state of our internal social cohesion and national security with the way these people have been behaving, desecrating our war memorials and attacking MPs' offices. And so unless they understand that concern, and of course the key concern of cost of living pressures, these are the things that Australians care about, and to be so fascinated and wrapped up in, boutique factional concerns of positions people have held, or, whether they wear a keffiyeh or not, this is not what the Australian public wants to see. They want to see this government being sensible, governing for our security, governing for the promotion of an international rules-based order. And what's happening right now is we're seeing an abandonment of those principles.
Is Anthony Albanese abandoning those principles in pursuit of Muslim and Greens votes?
Look, I think it's a bit of a myth about this Western Sydney thing. I mean, where would the Muslim vote go? They're going to vote for the coalition. Is there any significant Greens vote there to sort of coalesce with around preference deals? So the lesson is, understand where the community is on this, and then reset your moral compass, reset your policy, and let's be, clear about our potential offering for a future Australia as we go forward to the next election. Otherwise, I think they're going to be heading for a big problem.
Why then do you think Anthony Albanese has been so weak on this issue, and what does he need to do?
I think there's a lot of division in the caucus right now, and there have been no clear voices pointing out policy options and political realities. The judgment, is fading there on that sort of thing. So, it's going to be difficult for any leader to be in that situation, to deal with a kind of a divide like that internally. But that's what leadership's all about. You've got to stand up and point the way for your team. He won't be well regarded if he's led us to a first-term defeat. And so, you to stand up and work out what your, priorities are in terms of your political agenda, but also what your legacy is going to be going forward. So, what are you here for? I remember when I first went into Parliament, I said, look, at the end of this thing, I just want to be able to pass the shaving mirror test before everything else. And in a community with a lot of diverse attitudes, it was just easy for me to pick what I thought was the right thing to do, go out and argue it, because you weren't going to make everyone happy, but at least they'd listen to you and they might give you points for standing up for something. So I'd say to Albo, look, mate, reset your moral compass, stand up for something here. The community will reward you for that.
Mike Kelly, thanks so much for joining us.
No worries, Chris. Thanks heaps.